This podcast is brought to you by Business Radio, powered by Wharton.
Look at all the lonely people.
Welcome back. This is Dollars and Change on SiriusXM 111. I'm Cheryl Kuhlman.
And I am Nick Ashburn.
And we just played Eleanor Rigby.
Yes, and in case you were wondering, there is actually a new Beatles channel on SiriusXM 18 launching today. It's sort of this British invasion of SiriusXM. So if you are a Beatles fan, like maybe I'm looking for, Back in the USSR or another
Norwegian
song.
Wood.
Yeah. You can hear that on SiriusXM Channel 18 starting today.
Great. But we're not doing Beatles now.
No, we are talking about business and social impact.
And risk and change. And we are welcoming Bryan Bloom, who's the CFO of ENODO Global. Bryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Cheryl.
It's good to have you on. So, we just finished a section with Deanna von Mastake from Equileap. And a lot of what we were talking about was investment risk. That if you understand some of the gender issues and what companies can do around that, you can understand risk better, and then you can get better investments. And I think ENODO has a very interesting approach to mitigating risk. So why don't you tell us what ENODO does?
Sure, happy to. At its core, ENODO is a risk advisory or business intelligence firm. But the way that we're unique in the lens through which we look at risk for investment and just across organizations and their operations is through a social risk lens.
And explain what a social risk lens is.
Sure. We define social risk as the challenges that emanate from the population. Now, in today's world, that could be individuals, activist groups, or even nefarious networks like drug cartels or terrorist organizations. And social risk is how these actors can affect government programs or even private sector investments. And on the flip side, where a lot of people actually don't look, how these public sector organizations and private companies affect the populations. And what we found is that when grievances aren't addressed or basic needs are not met, this social risk increases, and the impact on organizations depends on the industry or sector. But with the proliferation of communication technology, these groups have more influence than ever before to very quickly coalesce around an idea or even a meme to increase negative public sentiment, have protests, strikes, litigation, or even violence.
And so, Bryan, is this primarily in sort of emerging markets or developing economies, or is this also relevant for the U.S. and Western Europe?
I'm so glad you asked that, Nick. That's probably one of the first questions we get from most potential clients and some of our partners. The fact of the matter is that social risk exists everywhere. It's kind of, we use this when we're chatting with folks for the first time. I don't know if either of you own polarized sunglasses. Have you ever been shopping for sunglasses and get the polarized kind?
Yeah.
So when you're looking at the wall, at least when usually the salesperson does it, they say, here are the normal glasses, and they have you look at the wall. And then they give you the polarized sunglasses, and all of a sudden that word polarized appears on the wall. Have you guys experienced that?
No.
So it's the same thing with social risk. Once you understand it, everyday life, you see it.
Yep.
So you see it in the U.S. all the time. Look at the recent Pepsi commercial. We talk a lot about the election of President Trump. We actually are launching, I think today, hopefully, first ever social risk training in collaboration with Texas A&M and Extension Service, Tech. That's really geared towards first responders, so police, firefighters, people that sort. So it's everywhere, absolutely everywhere.
So what does that training look like? Can you give me an example of what people are learning in that? Because I'm kind of, it sounds interesting, but I'm not quite catching the concrete detail.
Sure. So it's an introductory. It's about a 1-hour course. And what it does is it introduces the concept of social risk. So the introduction I just gave, explaining it at a very high level, the threats that emanate from the population. It's very unique. It's tailored to every situation, whether it's a government program or an investment. And it affects different industries and geographies differently. So what we do in the first half of the course is really just introduce the concept. But as you can imagine, or, when I was in school, and I'm sure when we were all in school, case studies really help bring things alive. Yep. So we actually walk through, the Black Lives Matter movement, the the response to that with the Blue Lives Matter movement. We look at the North Dakota pipeline for a private sector example. And then we look at the protests during the election or during the inauguration of President Trump as another example. So basically to show how it can affect, different parts or different aspects of life across society.
Yeah, and it goes to Nick's question. Those are all U.S. examples.
Well, I was sort of
Absolutely.
Yeah, and excuse me. I'm thinking. Okay, if you brought up the Pepsi example, we talked about that on the show just a couple weeks ago. The Black Lives Matter movement seems relevant for PepsiCo because they tried to incorporate it into their marketing materials. But how might a protest like the Women's March in D.C. around the inauguration, or Black Lives Matter, or any of these things? How do I think about that from a company perspective?
It's a great question. The first thing you asked was, is this applicable in developed nations like the U.S.? And I said yes, it's everywhere, and I think I said a couple times it affects every geography and every industry, although in unique ways. And the third thing we always try to hammer home with folks is that there's no consistent way to measure it, let alone address it. So the typical marketing campaigns look across how is this going to affect different demographic groups, and they build up a typical person in their mind, a 25 to 35-year-old female that works out 3 times a week, goes out to eat with her friends twice a week, sees a movie once a month, goes to church on Easter and Christmas. And they create this persona, and it's the what. It's what the person does. And the way we look at social risk and the way that it can apply and we conduct social risk analysis is looking a level below that, looking at the why. So you could have someone that's the exact same person A and person B, who do the exact same things and fit that persona, but why they do those things could be completely different. And that's what we're saying organizations need to understand whenever they have a strategic or even an operational decision to make. I can give examples on, why was there a protest in the North Dakota pipeline when there are other pipelines that had no protests that received international attention? And it really comes down to social risk. So,
but go a little deeper on that. Why was there the protest at Dakota and not elsewhere?
Sure. So what we have a hypothesis. We have a methodology that gives people a way to consistently measure social risk and then address it. And that hypothesis is based on identity conflict theory or identity politics. Are you two familiar with that, or should I? Let's
break it down for our listeners.
Right.
Sure. So the hypothesis is that identity informs perceptions, worldviews, and shapes behavior. And everyone has multiple identities across race, religion, ethnicity, gender, even your sports affiliations. I'm a Boston sports fan and was pretty upset about losing last night. So let me give you a quick example of how that plays out. Hopefully you guys can play along with me. So you have a fireman and a lawyer standing at a street corner. And
I know the punchline of this joke. No, I'm kidding.
When a window breaks and fire starts shooting out of the window and someone from inside that building screams, what does each person do? What does the fireman do?
He runs towards the fire to rescue the person.
What does the lawyer do?
They are waiting for the ambulance to show up so they can talk to the person to see who's liable.
Exactly. That's why we love using that example. Everyone has their own great punchline. So what we're saying there is identity leads to behavior. And so by looking at identity, we're able to look at all the data out there on social media, on mainstream media, on anything that's open source, anything that you can, polling, focus groups, pretty much anything, structured, unstructured data, and filter it through that one variable so you can understand what's going to trigger people to act, what's going to inform their behavior. And so for the North Dakota pipeline, obviously there were everyday issues with environmental risk and water supply issues, but it was when it threatened the Native American identity that it really got national and then international attention.
Interesting. We're talking with Bryan Bloom, who's the CFO of ENODO Global. This is Dollars and Change on SiriusXM 111.
And Bryan, so this does bring me to a couple of things. So going into this segment, I was thinking your business and what ENODO does resonated with me from a research base with a faculty member named Veet Heinisch, who talks about corporate diplomacy and what can corporations, especially extractive industries and emerging markets, how do they be better corporate citizens that mitigate those types of social risks I think you're talking about. And then, but really also now it comes to mind with, I think, another Wharton professor, as well as I think a SiriusXM co-host, Americus Reed, who is a brand identity researcher. And I'd be curious now, like if we had both of those faculty members here to talk about, like, have they ever thought about the overlap in their work and how that might affect, what ENODO does? And so my question for you is more,
connection, Nick. Yeah.
Is the work that you're doing, are you able to potentially predict when an outbreak of maybe a protest or some sort of disruptive activity might occur?
So that's a great question, and if either of them are listening, happy to have them call in immediately, and we can have a discussion, Nick.
Veet, Americus, call in.
And you made me think of a couple of things. So I'll get to the prediction question, but you're absolutely right. The extractive sector is where I think a lot of these issues come up very clearly. And again, going and being able to use one single variable to filter through all the data is really helpful. We've worked with extractive organizations before in minerals and mining and oil and gas, and we found that on average they're very siloed organizations. The security folks don't talk to the public relations people. The marketing people don't talk to the CSR people. And the corporate affairs people, and business intelligence is done in a dark room somewhere that no one ever actually gets the intelligence across the rest of the organization.
Even though there are risks across all of those
areas,
disciplines within the business that would be important for business intelligence.
Exactly. And we actually talk about that when we introduce social risk to people for the first time, because it is definitely not something discussed or something that has been quantified and been measured before. And what we talk about is that social risk is a slice of the pie, the risk pie, the risk portfolio that just goes, unnoticed or unchecked or uninvestigated. But in addition to that, it's actually polka dots across all the other pieces of the pie. When you have increased social risk, you have increased political risk. And when you have increased social risk, you have increased regulatory risk when people might change the law because of unrest at a site. You have increased default risk if you have a protest or strike and you can't pay your debt payments. So it's definitely something that comes out a lot in the extractive sector, and that's actually where ENODO started when we first started working with private sector organizations. Now, to get to your question specifically on the prediction, we actually say we never predict. No one can predict a trigger event. It's impossible, to be honest with you. It is just impossible. And when folks come and say that we're going to be able to tell you when an attack happens or when a protest happens, to be honest, we think we've never met someone that can consistently back up that claim.
You call BS.
However, yes, I wasn't going to go there. But
we're on SiriusXM. We can.
Nick is the Howard Stern of dollars and change.
I don't think that's a good thing, but all right.
But I will tell you this. You can, and this comes back to having a methodology and having a process that drives the analysis instead of bringing in personal biases or saying, hey, we're going to go address this social issue in this area. We're going, and I know you said your previous, speaker was talking about women's issues.
Right.
For us, I think everyone can agree that equality in genders is a good thing. But what we do is we never bring a bias in. I worked a lot in Afghanistan, and there were a lot of programs. Even Goldman Sachs had a 10,000 women program there, or 10,000 women-owned businesses. And the fact of the matter is, it wasn't as successful because they brought their Western lens and their Western mindset and trying to overlay it into Afghanistan. And so what we do is we conduct a baseline analysis to uncover what are the basic needs that the people actually want, a much more bottom-up approach, and what are the existing grievances, where's the minefields of things that might cause a trigger event. And so while we never say we can predict the event, by creating that baseline and having that scientific process to look at the data across whatever geographic area you're operating in, you are able to forecast that level of social risk, and then come up with very tailored mitigation strategies.
Well, Bryan, can you talk a little bit about that? And again, we're talking to Bryan Bloom, who's the CFO of ENODO Global. So you don't predict, because rightfully, no one can predict. You go in and do an analysis. And if I'm a company and I've got your analysis about some of the risks that might come from, identity and some of the social risks, what else? What do I do with that information?
No, it's a great question. I think, again, when I was in business school, case studies always brought things alive for me. So why don't I give you a recent example of
Sure.
an analysis that we've been conducting. So about 6 months ago, we entered the Saudi Arabia market. As you can imagine, I don't know if you're familiar, actually. I should start there with Vision 2030.
In Saudi Arabia?
Correct.
No. I mean, so
Okay,
many
great.
countries have sort of their own strategic plans, but not familiar with Saudi Arabia specifically.
Perfect. So a little background. So Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 is their plan to diversify away from their reliance on oil and gas. You've probably heard about the upcoming Saudi Aramco IPO, where they're going to float about 5% of the company. That's one piece of a whole program across every single government agency there that's going to promote this transition. So that's the context.
Uh-huh.
One of those issues that they're looking at is increasing female participation in the workforce by 5%. So a great goal, but how do you actually do it? And this gets to your question, Cheryl.
Yeah, right.
Now that you have this analysis, what do you do with it? So we looked across, and we just did I'll give you the high level results. We looked at 4 different demographic groups: men under the age of 25, women under the age of 25, men over the age of 65, and women over the age of 65. As you can imagine, their sentiment to that goal is different. You guys can take a wild guess of which group has the most negative sentiment against that.
Exactly, over 65.
Exactly, and it's specifically men over the age of 65.
Mm-hmm.
So the question then becomes, how does social risk analysis help you achieve that goal? Because they're going to try. The Deputy Crown Prince put out this plan. So what we did is we looked at what is a common identity across those 4 different demographic groups. And we found that there was a common identity of nationalism. So what do you do with that? Well, you look at the plan to introduce women into the workforce, and you look at nationalism. So you create a narrative that says, we're going to introduce women into a vocational training program in the defense sector so that Saudi Arabia can make their country strong and defend itself from external threats such as, and fill in the blank. And so while that actually decreased the amount of negative sentiment by 25% across all 4 different demographic groups.
Because it tied to this common sense of nationalism and wanting to make Saudi Arabia stronger.
Right. And I don't want you to think that it's a traditional marketing firm approach, because it's not. It has to do with the methodology and looking through that identity lens and that social risk analysis lens. Because you could say, oh, well, that's easy. Obviously, everyone's nationalistic in their country and proud of their country. Yes, that's probably true to some extent. But is that the best answer? Is that the one that's going to give you the biggest return on your investment? That's what we do. We've created that scientific approach to measuring it consistently, and then more importantly, as you were asking, Cheryl, addressing it.
And so Bryan, we've been talking about the enterprise level, and I think that makes a lot of sense. The corporate level, that's your client base. Are investors starting to get more savvy around these types of risks so that, if I'm now sitting at the corporate level in investor relations, hey, I've worked with ENODO, I know we're trying to mitigate these things. Are they fielding questions about this more and more too?
It's so funny you say that. I had a previous life in investment banking, so I'm very familiar with the risk committees and the questions that come up during that. And I'll be honest with you, most people just accept this as a risk. They don't know that there's an option out there. ENODO is only 3 years old. We're blazing the trail talking about social risk in this scientific way. And so I don't think there are a lot of folks out there that know that this is available in a way to actually lower the risk profile and increase risk-adjusted returns. With that said, I think the questions, as you asked, Nick, do come up. There aren't solutions out there. are not many solutions out there.
Yeah, thank you for your answer, because I think that's really helpful. I did set you up because I am hearing, I'm hearing sort of anecdotally, yes, it's happening more and more. But I think to the point is that the analysts on the, the investment banking side don't necessarily know even what they're asking for. They certainly don't have the data or the methodologies to accurately price that. And from a scientific basis, that's what we are so hungry here at Wharton to start figuring out. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's, the traditional way of doing it is you bring in a expert. So you bring in an ex-State Department person or an ex-CIA person that was covering, let's call it Colombia. And what we say is, okay, you have that expert in Colombia. Now you have another opportunity with the same financials for an investment in Argentina. And you have another expert for Argentina. How do you compare their opinions? They're going to bring their own natural biases. They're going to bring their own worldviews. And what we're saying is, in a data-rich world, there is an opportunity to really provide some rigor behind the analysis that's consistent. So yes, I know you did kind of throw me a softball there, but that's exactly what we're saying. There's that slice of the risk portfolio, and we're trying to fill that, and it's actually having a ripple effect because social risks are a lot of the cases of extreme downside losses and black swan events for investors.
Oh, I have a random quick question for you. Okay, let's say there was someone had hired the ex-CIA person in Colombia and the ex-State Department for Argentina. Who's more cynical in their analysis?
We always say, I'll respond back with a pithy comment that we usually tell people. We get this a lot when we go into countries for the first time. We obviously, as an American-based company, we always go to the State Department and USAID and introduce ourselves just as we're entering the market. And we've had some folks come to us and say, you don't know this country. I know this country like the back of my hand.
Right.
And I just say, why is it so screwed up then? Why haven't you fixed it?
Yeah.
The definition of, stupidity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
I used to work on State Department projects and USAID projects in a previous life, and I do feel like that's one of the biggest reasons why I left that sort of field. I wanted more innovation. I wanted to think more critically about these issues.
Right, and I think that a lot of this really is, and we're thinking about this broadly, but in terms of how you what the risk is, how you measure, how you think about things differently so that you're able to not have places that are messed up stay messed up, not have the same approaches that don't work continue to be applied. So It's really interesting. So Bryan, we are coming to the end of our segment, but so, in the 30 seconds or so that we have left, what's on the horizon for ENODO Global?
No, thanks for asking. We're pretty excited. Like, as I mentioned, we are launching our first online training in collaboration with Texas A&M, the extension service there. And we're pretty excited about that. But we're actually we're expanding pretty quickly. We got new requests every day to help folks out. And our goal is just to become the premier social risk advisor for anyone that really wants to solve the problems, to engage the population, to understand what the challenges are.
Great.
And Nick, to your original question, I don't care what side of the aisle they're on. I don't care what geography it is. We're always looking through all the risks through a population-centric lens, and we really just want to help the people. There's definitely that altruistic component of ENODO, and we're really excited to continue to do that.
That's great.
And one of the things I really do like is that image of the polarized sunglasses, because it is true. Once you start realizing some of the impact of this, it's just that extra bit of understanding that helps you be a little bit more thoughtful as you walk around the world.
Absolutely.
So this is learning for all of you listeners. You can do this as well. So we are heading into our break. When we come back, we are going to have I lost my
Andre
sheet.
Czerny.
Andre Czerny, who's going to be talking about that, and we will discuss aspiration.
Yes, this bank is telling you what you're purchasing is, and is it
as you purchase it? It's an app, so we're going to have to look at that and see, because again, this is all really helpful for, I think. It's all about knowing what's out there. It's all about understanding what the risk is, understanding who's doing different work around gender lens. It's about understanding what companies do. This show is about making you smarter.
It's more information. It's more data. Yeah. It's more transparency.
So you understand more. You make better decisions. So this is Dollars and Change on SiriusXM 111. We'll be back.
For more insight from Business Radio, please visit businessradio.wharton.upenn.edu.